As the Street Fighter 4 project went on and you became more and more involved with it, like as a really more hardcore Street Fighter fan player, tournament player, how did you then balance? Because I think one of the big things about this one was they also tried to make it reach a wider audience, maybe a little more accessible. I mean, how did you personally feel about that sort of thing?
It's always a balancing act. So for me, I guess there's sort of, boy, I could bore you guys endlessly about this one. For me, there's two things. One is fighting games are awesome, not just because of the code that's in the game. What makes it awesome is that I get to fight you. And I get to look at some dude and be like, I'm going to beat you.
Right.
So it's the personalities and it's the players that are playing against. So it's not just, you're not just fighting against a computer, and the mechanics and all that play into it, but really it's other people that make a fighting game awesome. So if, some crummy game like, Eternal Champion, now we're going to get hate mail about the Eternal Champions dude.
I'm sure all
come on.
the one guy. Eternal Champion CD was amazing. I played with the EGM character.
You don't understand. I do actually understand exactly what's happening in Eternal Champions. But anyway.
You're mentally ill.
Whatever game, if you get like 10 million people playing that game instantly gets way better. And I mean that not in some sort of abstract way. Like, the game is actually better because you have people pushing it to a new level, discovering new tactics, investing more of themselves in there, and really squeezing every last ounce of something out of that. So part of
Eternal Champions had only found its audience.
Right. If they had a better
part of the problem.
They had a better community team, we'd all be playing it right now. But yeah, so I mean, obviously it's a balancing act between you got to have the core and the heart of the game has to be there and has to be solid, but then you also want a game that everybody can actually play. So there's, Blaze Blue is an amazing fighting game in a lot of ways, but I criticize it because it's like, I say it's a game that most humans can't actually play.
Yeah.
Like, there's so many mechanics going on there. Fighting games in general are harder than most games in terms of like the interface and whatever. And I think really what killed an amazing fighting game scene was because the way every version that would come out, there was more stuff. So now there's CAP groove, and there's isms, and there's all this other crazy stuff. So even characters you thought you knew, now there's like 18,000 different techniques going on with those characters, and it becomes sort of overwhelming. So basically they would stack mechanics. Like, the original Street Fighter 2 mechanics are not that easy. Like, there's people that have been playing the game for like, 20 years that are still have trouble sometimes getting a Dragon Punch in a clutch situation. What a lot of the later games did was just to stack more and more difficult mechanics on top of that, which is great if you've been along for the ride like me the entire time. That's cool and it's fun and it's engaging. But then if I want to introduce you to a game and you've never played it before, now the bar used to be, the Street Fighter 2 mechanics plus a little incremental steps. Now you have all those incremental steps added up and you're faced with basically like a textbook, like a college level course on like how to even do the inputs for the game, and that's just...
Do you feel like other genres are suffering from that same thing?
I mean, I think we were chatting about this one time about kind of what killed the shooter, the shoot 'em up genre. Because it really became too complex. It became bullet hell, and
it's just root memorization at some level with a lot of the games.
Nintendo's entire premise this generation has been that video games in general, video games universally, have become too complex, and their entire core concept has been to simplify it, to reduce interface complexity, to make games more accessible. And you can argue whether or not they've been successful at that, or whether that's been to the detriment of gaming, but that's been incredibly successful for them, because I think there have been a lot of people who have been kind of sidelined by just games of any sort. Like, you look at a Banjo-Kazooie type game, or any modern 3D platformer, and you've got like bizarre contortions for your hands that you have to give yourself arthritis just to play them. And I think fighting games have definitely been sort of the epitome of that. I mean, like Street Fighter 3 Third Strike is considered one of the greatest fighting games ever, but it took years for people to really come to appreciate it, just because there was so much complexity and intricacy to it.
Yeah, even the top American players really sucked at it for a long time. To master all the mechanics that are going on in that game is just extremely difficult. And does that make for a great game? Yeah, I mean, there's a great game to be played there, but the executional bar, like all the skills and hoops you have to jump through before you're even really playing the core game, is just really high. And so that's why I had these feelings even before I started working at Capcom, because as somebody who was busy organizing the scene and trying to get... so our tournaments would grow and grow because they were great, even though the scene overall was shrinking. So there were less and less players, even as the tournament scene was growing. But I was angry at those games because I felt like they'd alienated people. They made everybody feel like they sucked at fighting games. And you don't have to have a complex game in order to have a deep game. And I think that's a confusion also. So I think that was a lot of, I don't want to call it bad design, but it was a bad design path. Because there was great game design in there, but they layered it behind a lot of complexity.
Like the base premise was wrong.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the thing. Like, rocks, paper, scissors is like the essence of fighting games in a lot of ways.
Well, it's basic psychology. I mean, that's actually one of the things that kind of changed my perception. And I'm not a hardcore fighting game fan or even a player by any stretch of the imagination. But that's one of the things Richard Lee here at 1UP that totally like kind of changed my perspective on how to play a fighting game. He said it's almost like poker in a lot of ways. You're not playing the hand you're dealt. You're not really playing the character you're playing. You're playing the person who's playing the other character and trying to trick them into allowing you to hit them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the poker fighting game analogy is not a strain in any way, shape, or form. And actually, a lot of the top guys are major poker players. I used to make my living in college also playing poker. We've one of the longest term guys on an old scene guy, Havad Khan, got sixth place, I think, in the World Series of poker.
Oh, wow.
Like 2 years ago, and then won a couple $1 million since then in like other tournaments. So the fighting game and poker mentality is very much the same, and that's exactly right. It's a game of psychology. In poker, everyone can execute the moves because you just have to pick up your cards and make sure you don't flop them over. And Street Fighter, it's a lot more involved mechanically, which is what makes the bar to entry higher. But yeah, very much the same mechanic.
Like I remember, Tekken, for instance, that series. Like I used to, that was a game that I just like used to play with some of my college buddies all the time, and I never really thought of it as like a really deep fighter. And then after I moved out to the West Coast, I went to a tournament in, I think it was like San Jose. I went to check out this Tekken tournament. My mind was blown by like how deep the game was, but also like how passionate everybody was about it, and just like I was seeing like moves and just combos and everything that I just had no idea about, and it just like, so I guess the game was so much more deeper than I thought.
Somewhere James Milky is like rolling.
Yeah, I know.
It's like, but it's all about Virtua Fighter.
But even that too, to a lot of people, you could say the same.
But the complexity of fighting games, I think, is kind of a deterrent just because they look so complicated. And, I found that I'm not a really great fighting game player, but I really did enjoy Street Fighter back in the day. And if I play with someone who has about the same level of expertise as me, who just kind of knows the essentials and the basics, I can still have a great time with it. But if I go up against someone who's been playing like every iteration of Street Fighter and knows how to parry in Street Fighter 3 and knows how to do the special moves and use the new characters in Street Fighter 4, it's not going to be fun. Right. And that's kind of like, I think there's that intimidation factor that keeps new or less experienced people away from the fighting game genre. Like, I'm not going to play against someone in an arcade in Japan. As fun as it would be to play, a fighting game in an arcade, I would just be slaughtered. It'd be a waste of 100 yen.
Not if you have a lit cigarette and you just put it right down your eye.
I don't smoke. That's my problem.
That's the thing. You just light it and sit it there, and it'll be primed and ready to go.
Well, that's been a lot of what we've been trying to do, is to sort of remove a bit of that intimidation factor. I mean, they can be deep games, but again, deep and complex don't have to be the same thing. And the thing I always say ultimately about fighting games, I mean, they're not for everybody, right? It is a niche genre, and it's not going to be the kind of thing that, everybody, your mom, and it's not going to be like one of those Nintendo ads where your grandma and the postman and like your 6-year-old
I would love
cousin
for
are
my
all
grandmother
sitting
to
around.
pull off a spinning bird kick. That'd be amazing.
I saw Microsoft showing an entire family doing dragon punches and fireballs using the power of Natal. So I believe you're wrong.
Natal makes everything possible.
What was that, dear? Shoryuken?
It's true, but we're trying to open the doors for people, because the thing I ultimately say about fighting games, not for everybody, but you get back what you put in. So if you invest more in it, you're going to get a much more rewarding experience, and that's a pretty special thing in games or anywhere else. So it's neat to find something that's deep enough and means enough to other humans that you can really make an investment there and get some amazing payback.
Well, being a part of Capcom, I think you guys are in a not entirely unique situation when it comes to Japanese game companies, in that you have a lot of franchises that are near and dear to a lot of people for a long time. What do you find is different dealing with fighting game communities, which you definitely have a lot of experience with, versus something like a Resident Evil community, or, Strider community, or any of these
I left my manga in my office.
any of these other, like, in some ways equally hardcore communities. Like, how do you deal with those and feel like you give those communities the same amount of attention, since you can't hold a Mega Man tournament unless you're playing Tatsunoko versus Capcom?
Right. Yeah, obviously the competitive angle makes certain kind of engagement easy. But those communities have, I mean, as you said, their own sort of language and their own engagement with the product. So Resident Evil tends to be much more story-driven. So those are people who are very interested in story details and ephemera and possible tie-ins and maybe more fan fiction and things like that.
Are there people who understand the Resident